Good morning and welcome to day 2. I think you probably all collapsed yesterday evening after a very intense day. But this is the second half, and of course today is very exciting because we actually are not only having a very interesting fifth panel, but then actually also try to bring the raw material being presented at the various panels together in a final session and try to bring some synthesis to this. With further ado, I will just now give the word to my co-chair, Dr. Fineberg, to actually introduce this morning's panel.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dijkgraaf. This morning's panel has a very interesting assignment, and it is basically on the assumption that there will be gain-of-function research conducted. Precisely under what conditions should this research be actually carried out? The panel is going to have an overview and a discussion of this topic that we will cover in our first session. Our plan for the day, following the discussion by the panel and some open discussion with our audience in attendance, we're then going to take our break, which is a late morning, early lunch break, and then we'll come back to reassemble after that for the final panel of the day. For this session this morning, I'm very pleased to be able to introduce the co-moderators who will lead the discussion, and they are Dr. Kirsten Jacobson, who is the Manager of Biosafety Risk Assessment in the Pathogen Regulation Directorate for the Public Health Agency of Canada, and Dr. Zarifa Reed, who's Medical Director of Sentinext Therapeutics, based in Malaysia. Thank you very much. I now turn the program over to our co-moderators.
Do I have to do anything to turn this on? I don't think so. It's on. Good morning. Thank you for the introduction. We have the fortune, or maybe the misfortune actually, of following 4 excellent panels yesterday and trying to tease out the elements that weren't already captured from this discussion we've been having. Today we will address the biosafety and biosecurity requirements applicable to HPAI H5N1 gain-of-function research and discuss the conditions, if any, under which this type of research could be supported and conducted. Try to do some work to identify the specific standards that should be in place for future research in this area. So without further ado, I'll pass over to my co-moderator who will lead the panelist presentations.
Thank you, Kristen. So our first speaker is Dr. Robbert Wyant, who's the Director, Division of Select Agents and Toxins at the Coordinating Office for Terrorism Preparedness and Emergency Response at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the U.S. Dr. Wyant?
Thank you, Dr. Reed. Since I'm the sort of the lead-off hitter of this group of deep thinkers, I thought that I might focus my remarks on sort of helping to set the table for the discussion. And so I'll have some general remarks on the concepts of biosafety and biosecurity. And also I'd like to update you on some regulatory initiatives that the CDC has ongoing in this area. When one thinks of microbes as hazards, we're in a very, as I'm sure most of you, if not all of you in this room know, we're in a very complex arena. As a hazard, a microbe has some challenging characteristics. The fact that they are self-replicating, that there's such a wide variety of them, and that there's such a wide variety of hazard. So in establishing any kind of a security, safety, or control program around this type of a hazard, one really needs to take a risk assessment approach. If you look at any of the authoritative references in this area, including the WHO manual, the Canadian biosafety guidelines, here in the United States we use a book called the Biosafety and Microbiological and Biomedical Laboratories Manual, even the recently promulgated ICN guidelines. are all based on risk assessment. So what are sort of the key pieces of a biosafety risk assessment? And typically they focus on three areas. One needs to look at and understand the characteristics of the agent that we're attempting to contain and protect folks from. Its transmissibility, its pathogenicity, its virulence. Also, one needs to look at what you intend to do with the agent. What sort of processes are going to be applied to the agent. So the characteristics of the processes also need to be a consideration in the risk assessment. And the third primary piece of a biosafety risk assessment has to do with who's going to work with the agent. How well trained is the staff? What's the immune level of the staff and the environment around this agent? So those are, when one attempts to do a biosafety plan based on risk assessment, those are three primary areas that are looked at. In the area of biosecurity, although a lot of the tools that are used are similar to what would be used in a biosafety risk assessment, there are some fundamental differences. In the realm of biosecurity, the agent is not the hazard. The hazard is the people working with the agent and the environment around the agent. And that's fundamental to a biosecurity risk assessment. There are three fundamental pieces to a biosecurity risk assessment. One is to look at the threats that are present that would impact the misuse of this asset. In this case, the agent is not the hazard now. The agent is an asset you're trying to protect. These threats may be external or internal. If you plan on working with the agent near an ocean, for example, one needs to consider the possible impact of a hurricane in a biosecurity risk assessment. The second piece are vulnerabilities. What's in place at your agent that would increase the risk of misuse. And the third thing that one needs to look at in a biosecurity risk assessment is consequence. What would conceivably happen if this agent were misused or released? And in my final few seconds, I would like to just update you on an assessment that we're doing at CDC related to whether or not these new viruses with gain of function should be regulated as HHS select agents. This past October, we published a notice in the United States Federal Register asking for input from the public on whether or not these viruses were significant threats to public health and safety, and if so, under what conditions they could safely be worked with. We have determined that we will extend the comment period for this notice until the end of January 2013. So we would welcome any comments that you may have for issues that we should consider. Comments can either be sent to the CDC address in the Federal Record Notice or electronically to the Federal Register. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wayne. Our next speaker is Dr. Joseph Kanabrocki, who's the Assistant Dean of Biosafety and Associate Professor of Microbiology at the University of Chicago.
Thank you. Good morning. So I want to follow up on Rob's comments. In my mind, obviously, the risk assessment function is central to biosafety oversight. And I thought it would be a good place to begin this discussion is to talk about risk assessment and risk groups in particular. And so I went looking to see where I could find definitions of risk groups from around the globe, and I found, the World Health Organization. Obviously, we have the NIH and CDC risk groups, the Australian, New Zealand risk groups, Canadian Laboratory Safety Guidelines describe risk groups, as does the European Economic Community. And when you read these definitions of these various risk groups, one thing that really jumped out at me for risk group 4, and that is that the common element is that generally effective treatments and or preventive therapies are not available for agents assigned to risk group 4. And so we've had this interesting discussion about what containment level, it would be appropriate for viruses, influenza viruses, gain of function. And again, in my mind, the availability of therapeutic agents for these viruses is critical, and in my opinion, don't warrant assignment of these pathogens to risk group 4. Now, I'll come back to this a little bit later. Obviously, we're talking about a risk-benefit balance and how important it is that the important research be conducted. My worry is that if we restrict these viruses to containment at level 4, much of the work will not get done. It's already restricted in a great sense to, even when you restrict it to BSL-3 enhanced or BSL-3 ag. So, but again, I'll come back to that because I wanted to move along and talk about some other aspects of risk management from a biosafety perspective that I view to be very important. Now, again, common elements is question one, what are some of the common principles? And that is really what I focused my comments on here this morning. And obviously, there's the aspect of physical containment. And when we're talking about physical containment, we're talking about engineering controls contributed by the facility itself, the engineering controls contributed by equipment and personal protective equipment, and then, of course, most importantly, the practices and competency of staff that work on these agents. Another thing I found interesting in terms of common elements is the role of the Institutional Biosafety Committee. Under the NIH guidelines here in the US, of course, IBCs are required for research that involves recombinant DNA if that institution receives funding for recombinant DNA research from the NIH. And so that role of the IBC is very important. But when you look at World Health Organization and Health Canada, for example, they expand the scope of the IBC to include not only recombinant organisms, but also any infectious organisms, infectious to animals, infectious to man. And I very definitely support that expansion of the role of the IBC. I think it's really critical to have an institutional local oversight. So again, I think another really important paradigm here is that there be local oversight at the level of the IBC, that there be federal oversight, and again, here in the US, for this type of research, we're talking about the Select Agent Program, and I think it's really important to have international harmonization on some of these aspects. Another common element that I find, another theme you find that run through the various guidelines that you read there's an element of biological containment, and again, as I prepared for this presentation, I was struck by so many of the themes that were originally discussed at Asilomar so many years ago are being revisited here. Risk assessment, biological containment, physical containment, and those sorts of things, again, are themes, and even security are themes that were mentioned in the early days. Now, some other important considerations. I think it's real important to test to confirm for therapeutic efficacy of agents. And so, again, here you would want to make sure that any virus that might emerge is tested for sensitivity to antivirals as well as for its antigenicity. Training and competency of scientists is very important. Not only must they be well trained, but they must demonstrate competency in the laboratory. And furthermore, education of scientists in general, education of students in general is an important function. We all talk about the need to get the public on board in supporting our research, and I really think this is something we need to promote, is the value of the work we do. And I think the more we train young people and students about biosafety, biosecurity, and dual-use research of concern, you'll have a much more well-engaged public. Occupational health programs are critical. These should include vaccinations as well as health watch protocols. Understanding that a health watch protocol wherein someone who exhibits symptoms of any illness, whether or not they've had a known exposure, gets channeled into the occupational health program. This is really important. Culture of responsibility at the local level is really important. The PI has to demonstrate leadership, has to have direct involvement with the research, and shouldn't just be managing this from afar. I also believe that there should be institutional person, a responsible person at an institution who, in addition to the IBC and the PI, has an opportunity to comment and oversee the research. Again, as I said, IBC review at the local level, national review in terms of regulation or guidelines are important, but international harmonization is very, very important. And obviously, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about physical and IT security, but this is another element that is mentioned in a number of these various guidelines and is a very important consideration. So with that, I'll stop and move it along. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Jean Matthews, who's a senior fellow at the North Carolina Institute for Public Health at the Gillings School of Public Health at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill.
Thank you very much, Dr. Reed. I'm one of the two recovering lawyers on the program these 2 days. In a prior incarnation long ago and far away, I served for 25 years as Chief Legal Counsel at Centers for Disease Control. Part of that job was pattern recognition and transference of lessons learned. So I guess I'll try to respond quickly. The two questions, A and B, I can dispose of fairly quickly. Changes in current requirements, the GOF framework is an add-on to the existing matters. Robin just spoke about select agents, and Kevin Wolf will talk in a minute about import-export. Double use, I think, has been covered. One point I would make regarding the WHO pandemic influenza preparedness framework is that framework is based upon transparency. And there was a question from the floor about that yesterday. I think it's important as we look at the issues relating to closed cells of information as to how that might impact the PIP framework that WHO is trying to move ahead on. And of course, this adds another layer to the other layers listed on 1A. I'll come back in a minute to the question that certainly Dr. Fineberg was very familiar with in the swine flu affair report of how do you scale back down after you scale up. Very quickly on other models, not a lot exists, but go back and look at the smallpox virus destruction protocol in the 1990s that was worked on, and the parallel to that, which WHO still has a playbook on, I assume, is the poliovirus destruction planning that was worked on 6 to 8 years ago before polio broke back out again. Those bear some analogies here for dangerous agents and how to deal with them, though those are in a contracting field of research, and this GOF is in an expanding field of research, so it is not exactly the same. The other analogy, though, is the protocols that were that I was personally involved in putting into place in 1989 for the Ebola Reston virus that was discovered about 20 miles from here in the animal shipment facility at Dulles Airport. And so there were limitations quickly put in on the transport and movement of 3 types of non-human primates and how that played out. That was more of a reactive function, which is what this is. So in my last 2 minutes, let me talk about 3 pattern recognition principles that apply here: guns of August, windows of opportunity, and one-way ratchet. Guns of August, that's what this is about. Barbara Tuchman's book about the start of World War I in 1914 goes into very interesting insight into what happens when technology leaps ahead of strategy and doctrine. That's what's been happening for the past year in this field, and we are scrambling to put strategy, doctrine, and procedures in place to deal with the technology that's sort of the analog to machine guns and long-range artillery that World War I had to deal with. Second is windows of opportunity. We're moving along sort of at a linear pace, but be prepared. A window of opportunity, both politically and public education, a teaching moment, can open up whenever there's another big event of some type. So be prepared to move this agenda along when the next big event happens. The next big event will most certainly happen. And you see the analogy in this morning's paper about the tragedy in Connecticut and possible opportunities to do something in this country about gun control. So just draw your analogies and recognize your patterns. And then the last is the principle of the one-way ratchet, which my predecessor, Dick Reisberg, taught me well. It's easy to put in place a restrictive protocol. The hard part is how do you back down on it. So Dr. Fineberg and his colleague Richard Neustadt wrote eloquently on that with respect to the 1976 swine flu affair. We had to deal with the same matter at other times. So the question in my last 3 seconds is, who is watching the dashboard for when you need to ratchet this down? It becomes a risk-averse decision-maker's nightmare to say, we have this protocol that we've now created and put in place. How do we back out of it, knowing that eventually there will be some mistake downstream, and you don't want to be the elected official or the political appointee that released the ratchet on it. Liability and Q&As, I don't have time, and I'll respond in discussion if anybody wants to talk about liability. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Matthews. Our next speaker is Dr. Anna Lundroth-Jodin, who's a Deputy Head of Unit, Infectious Disease and Public Health at the DG's Research and Innovation at the European Commission, Brussels.
Good morning. Thank you very much for inviting the European Commission here. We're very pleased to be involved because we are one of the really greatest funder of influenza research in Europe. We have, in the last decade, invested over 150 million euros into influenza research, funding some 80 projects that involves over 300 institutions in 60 countries going beyond Europe, as you can hear. So that's the baseline, and I'd like to, in my presentation here, give an overview of how it works in the Commission and the Commission's position on these issues for the moment and the little longer-term perspective. And the emphasis will be on question 1A and B here. So anyone who is applying for a research grant in the European Commission has to declare that they comply fully with national EU safety ethics legislation and guidelines. So all research proposals that have passed a scientific scrutiny are also screened for any ethical, safety or dual use issues that may come up. And applicants are actually asked also to make a self-assessment for potential dual use implications of their work. But even if that is the case and they haven't declared it, this will be picked up anyway. Now, for those proposals where there are issues, they go on to a scrutinized, specialized ethics and biosecurity review board. And then the recommendations are, of course, on a case-by-case situation. So the first point I'd like to make here is the European Commission, regarding the legal framework that we have in Europe, the national law and EU law, we consider for the moment that that is adequate and that no change is necessary on the legal side regarding this type of research. However, we can become much better when it comes to being vigilant about the operations, being more aware of what's actually going on in the projects. And we fully subscribe to what's been said here in this workshop many times, that training of scientists is absolutely crucial, raising awareness. We do believe that the sort of softer approach rather than regulation is a much more productive way forward, because we find it very difficult to write some regulation or law that would exactly determine what is dangerous and what is safe. You can't predict that. You will always be behind. So we think it's better to address directly the scientists that are actually working in the lab to raise their awareness about these issues. Now, having said that then, within the projects, there are international collaborations that we're funding. We would like to have a better than today system for looking after the not only scientific progress that we're looking at today, but also the biosafety, biosecurity, and potential dual use issues where that is relevant. So that is, those are things we're looking at for the future. In the longer term perspective, it is to be recognized, so we're not only talking about influenza H5N1, we're looking at all sorts of pathogens, existing ones and those that are yet to be discovered. So we would like, whatever we install, we'd like to have something which is solid and works and can also anticipate the unforeseen. And we need to recognize that there could be actually far more dangerous experiments than those that we've been looking at in this workshop. Secondly, we have come a very long way in building up trust at the international level, and we would not like to see this jeopardized by let's say, stifling of very important research that needs to be done, or the dissemination of results that are actually very important for public health protection. So that leads me actually to the conclusion, which is we don't really have in our hands today the solution how all of these matters are to be solved, but we do believe strongly that continued dialogue with all of you and others who are in this field is the way forward, so that we can come up with something which is a harmonized approach that will work and be sustainable and not running running behind the evolution of events. We find it's a very difficult challenge to understand who is going to police, so to speak, the activities within the projects unless we have a specialized board and a continued dialogue and full awareness of the scientists who are working on this. So we are very much looking forward to continue this. We don't see this as sort of the end of anything, and we don't have any ready, let's say, new proposals for you, other than our position of today, as I said, is we don't see the need today to change the existing EU legislation. But I cannot speak on behalf of all my colleagues. Maybe the continued dialogue will actually lead to a change in this. This is something which is beyond my control. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Dr. Kevin Wolf. He's the Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Export Administration, the Bureau of Industry and Security at the U.S. Department of Commerce.
I have a 5-minute to 5-hour and a 5-day version of this talk. I'll stick to the 5-minute version. My name is Kevin Wolf. My bureau is responsible for regulating dual-use items of concern. It's the export administration regulations. My colleagues at the State Department under the International Traffic in Arms regulations have similar degrees of controls over the export of sensitive technology items, hardware, software, and services. Under our regulations, the export administration regulations, a license permit from the United States government, responsible for that is the Commerce Department, is required to release to foreign persons pretty much all of the technology that's at issue in this conference, and a long list of other types of technologies that are set out in our Commerce Control List, which is in the, again, it's part of the Export Administration regulations. And these controls extend not only to the physical release of particular items outside of the United States, but also the release of controlled technology to foreign persons within the United States. The type of technology here doesn't really have any exceptions available to it for nationals of particular countries. Even to nationals of Canada, a license would be required from the Commerce Department to release it. These regulations have been in place for several decades. They're there largely as a result of various international agreements that the United States has agreed to and administered by something called the Australia Group, which is a multilateral organization. When someone submits an application to release to foreign persons or to export outside of the United States controlled technology, that's reviewed by our counterparts at the Departments of State and Defense and also Energy in some cases, and they review it with respect to whether its release to foreign persons or outside the United States would be a national security or foreign policy issue, and if so, whether there should be any conditions, whether the license should be denied, or if it should be granted, whether the approval should be conditioned. The primary exception that most in this room think about with respect to the scope of these controls and these regulatory requirements which, by the way, have both civil and criminal penalties attached to them in the sense that if you deliberately violate the regulations, then they're enforceable by substantial monetary penalties or incarceration, and we do so regularly. But the primary carve-out to these regulations that this group is interested in, perhaps, are what are known as the fundamental research carve-outs or published information or public domain exceptions. And that is that information, regardless of content, and we're speaking only of unclassified information in this context, which is in the public domain, it's intended to be made freely and available without restriction or government limitation or without conditions such as published in journals. As a result of the First Amendment, doesn't fall within the scope of these two sets of export control regulations. Similarly, the results of fundamental research done with the intent of having it promulgated and used in basic science and research is also not within the scope of these carve-outs. There's also another limited carve-out with respect to information that's released in a curriculum course at a university. And the difficulty becomes in analyzing whether any particular fact pattern that you're dealing with, A, is within the scope of the controlled technology that we're dealing with for the production or development of a virus, for example, that's listed, and then B, whether that technology is within the scope of the various definitions of public domain or published information or fundamental research. With respect to this topic, so those are the conditions to respond to the topic of the assignment, under which research has to be conducted. The Commerce Department is working with the other parts of the U.S. government, NIH and HHS, in working out a way in which to work with these regulations and as part of conditions that the U.S. government would impose upon funding for this type of research to make more flexible and clear the scope of these conditions, that is, when fundamental research would apply or not, or when a license from the Commerce Department and reviewed by the other parts of the U.S. government would be permitted. So that's my 5-minute version. I'll come in a little bit short and then leave it for questions later.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Celia Alpuche Aranda. She is the Director of Research Center for Infectious Diseases at the National Public Health Institute in Mexico.
Well, good morning. First, I want to thank the organizers the opportunity that gave me to be here. It's a great meeting. The good part to participate at almost the end of the meeting and the panelists that I have listened to the discussion of many experts, and that's feeding my participation. But the bad part is that the most of my discussion points have been addressed before. So I'll do my best, and I'm going to try to focus some on the experience that we had in the Latin American region, mostly in Mexico. In regards of the first question of the common principles of biosafety and biosecurity, I would like to emphasize just a few things, that no matter the objectives of biosafety and biosecurity are different, they are usually complementary because they are also shared common concepts or components that they have been mentioned before, such as risk assessment and the others. But in fact, it's a total culture of work linked to responsibility and lying in bioethical principles. But sometimes some of these procedures may be conflicting between biosafety and biosecurity. And there's one example that you all know, the open and transparent signing of the type of hazards of microorganisms that they are being addressed in the specific laboratories. It's a rule for biosafety, and it's a problem for biosecurity. So, and I would like to extend these or extrapolate these to the example of the gain of function H5N1 research discussed here. And I'm not talking about a specific biosafety, biosecurity issues in laboratory. I'm talking about security and safety in public health. There is a concern here that is driven to classify or even limited the gain of function H5N1 research because of security issues. But at the same time, this condition will have a negative balance to obtain scientific evidence that may help a better preparedness and response for a possible pandemic with a highly pathogenic microorganism such as H5N1. So if we talk about the second question, do we need to extend biosafety, biosecurity, it has been addressed many times, and I just want to mention that it's obvious that those expert laboratories doing research in H5N1 here, that they are here discussing all these issues, they fulfill all the basic requirements for security of biological materials. But it is also true there is a lack of harmonized standard for exactly definition of BSL-3 enhanced out there in the world. And I'm talking about my own experience coming from a developing country with a very recent history of biosafety, biosecurity program up to BCL3 enhanced. We do not have BCL4s, and we are not doing a specific research in H5N1, only surveillance. We use a lot of help from our partners from CDC and National Microbiology Laboratory at Public Health Agency of Canada to increase our infrastructure. But we need to be practical and honest that it's not only a responsibility of international organizations to do more in these regards. It depends of each country. It depends of each institution to do more. There are many guidelines, programs to try to harmonize standards, WHO, CDC, NIH, European Commission. We've been listening all that. And programs, so Biological Weapon Convention, Dual Use Research of Concern, IHR. There are biosafety international associations now. There are in-countries biosafety associations. And I want to be optimistic that, and I think this culture of work is getting much better. So you know much better than me, but it seems that it doesn't need to extend the biosafety, biosecurity requirements, but we need to emphasize the harmonization of standards for BCL3, enhance it, and to make it not ambiguous. It needs to be very clear for everybody out there. In terms of other programs to oversight the research utilizing highly pathogenic agents, I just want to emphasize that I look very carefully in the Latin American countries, and I couldn't find a formal official document to do this. There are some mentions in the bioethic and in the ethic and security committees coming from IRBs and other research committees, but not, and we need to work on that. It has been also mentioned many times that the concern is not regarding the well-known experts working in H5N1 research. The concern is in those who may be using the information to do or to start doing research or for misuse. In my own experience in my country, this happens during the 2009 H1N1 pandemic. And in the confusion in the beginning part of the pandemic, when we did have very limited knowledge about the virus, several researchers with no experience in influenza suddenly became experts. And it's very hard to control that. So we really need to have in place the elements, the procedures to control that, to help to control that. But again, it's not humanly feasible to control each one of the possible misuse of these. So we all need to work together to push and to reinforce this. I will not add more about these different programs because they have been mentioned before. To finalize my participation, I would like to mention that our own experience in Mexico to develop infrastructure and human resources to work highly pathogenic microorganisms to become part of CDC Laboratory Response Network, LRN, also helped us to have much better prepared for H5N1 surveillance and to define much better our BCL3 enhanced. And now we're working to harmonize these with the animal surveillance part. And I'm pretty sure that some of these strategies in coming out of this meeting to make the highly pathogenic avian influenza H5N1 gain and function research better will have a positive impact to oversight other models for highly pathogenic microorganisms research in general. In conclusion, my personal opinion is that scientific evidence produced by gain-of-function highly pathogenic avian influenza H5N1 may be important for better preparedness and response, and for a pandemic influenza as a highly pathogen as this, and always, and maybe is much better, and in fact, if it's based on rationalized science, than nothing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Dr. David Harper. He is the Special Advisor to the Office of the Assistant Director General, at the Office of the Assistant Director General of Health, Security, and Environment at the World Health Organization in Geneva.
Well, thank you, Chair, and good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank the organizers for their kind invitation to the World Health Organization to participate in this, this discussion. It's very important. And it's always a real pleasure to look around the room and see old friends and colleagues, some of whom I've not met for some considerable time. I thoroughly enjoyed the discussion yesterday. I found it very interesting. And what I thought I would do is just start by saying a little bit about the World Health Organization. I'm sure that all of you, or most of you, are aware of what the World Health Organization is. The World Health Organization is its countries, its member states. Sometimes there is the perception that the people sitting in Geneva or at a regional level or indeed at a country level are the World Health Organization. I should point out, before we get into the post-panel presentation discussion, that in fact that's the Secretariat to the World Health Organization. So there's an important distinction there that might become apparent and important later. The organization and the Secretariat, the Assembly and the governing bodies it's the directing and coordinating authority for health within the United Nations system. It's responsible for providing leadership on global health matters, for shaping the health research agenda, importantly for setting norms and standards, for articulating evidence-based policy options, and particularly for providing technical help and support to countries and for monitoring and assessing health trends. And right the way back to the 1948, to the Constitution of the World Health Organization, at the heart of the Constitution is the statement of the need to attain for all people the highest possible levels of health. I'd like to use my few minutes to talk briefly about the first part of question 1 that we have on the screen, not venturing for the time being into A and B, but really just what is going on around the world, and in particular what have WHO done and what are we currently doing. And this is building on what my distinguished co-panelists have already said, of course. As far back as 1983, the World Health Organization published its Laboratory Biosafety Manual, and a couple of people have already mentioned that this morning and indeed yesterday. And this encouraged countries to accept and implement basic concepts in biosafety and to develop national codes of practice for the safe handling of pathogenic microorganisms within their geographical borders. Second edition was produced about 10 years later in 1993, and the third and the extant edition, which I'm sure many of you in the room will recognize, the so-called Red Book, was produced in 2004, and this edition also recognizes and introduces biosecurity concepts. You all know that biosecurity in this context means the protection of microbiological assets from theft, loss, or, interesting word, diversion. I'm not quite sure what that means, but diversion anyway, which could lead to the inappropriate use of agents and to cause public health harm. Unsurprisingly, in many ways, as ideas and thinking developed, there was a general feeling within the international community that something more was needed. And one important step amongst others around the world to try to address this need was taken in 2008 by CEN, the European Committee on Standardization, when it produced its workshop agreement 15793 for those aficionados amongst you, and a number of countries, non-European countries, and indeed the World Health Organization played a role in the workshop agreement development. And this focused far more on a management systems approach, built on the concept of continual improvement through a cycle of planning, implementing, reviewing, and improving the processes and actions that an organization undertakes to meet its goals. And this is a relatively well-known approach. It's an approach that international standards organizations have taken for many years, ISO and the like. So it's a well-tried and tested approach. This agreement was renewed in 2011, and I think it gives an indication of one of the key directions of travel in this important area. As colleagues have said this morning, it's very much a risk assessment and then risk management based approach. Now, you heard talk yesterday of international agreements and very brief mention of the international health regulations. So I thought I should just say a little bit about the international health regulations, which form a vital plank in our approach to dealing with many of these international infectious disease and toxicological and radiological hazards and way beyond that. What are they? Well, they were adopted in 2005. They're one of the very few international legal instruments that's binding in all of the 194 member countries of the World Health Organization. The aim is to help the international community prevent and respond to acute public health risks that have the potential to cross borders and to threaten people worldwide. Pandemic influenza, of course, is an excellent example of that sort of public health event. They entered into force on the 15th of June 2007, and countries are in the process of implementing. A lot of discussion at the World Health Assembly last May about how far countries had got in terms of the implementation of these important regulations. That was the deadline for full implementation, and a number of countries, for very good reason, understandable reasons, have requested a 2-year extension to the time that they will take for full implementation. The regulations define the rights and the obligations of countries to report public health events, and this is very important in the context of some of what was mentioned yesterday around surveillance, the need for good systems to be in place. They also establish a number of procedures that the World Health Organization must follow in its work to uphold global public health security. I can say more about that hopefully in the discussion session that follows the panel presentations if people would like to, or in fact happy to pick things up in the margins of the main discussion. In the context of the international health regulations, I'd just like to say something about our laboratory biorisk management. And in January this year, the strategy, the action plan, the framework for action has been applicable, and under the regulations, all state parties have made this legally binding commitment to assess, develop and maintain their national core capacities for surveillance, assessment and response. Appropriate laboratory capacities are essential for all the obvious reasons, and I won't go into them now. I know I'm running short of time. But they're essential to identify, confirm the agents involved in these public health events. And to meet IHR requirements, every state party, every country needs to access laboratory services domestically or internationally. So the aim of our strategic framework is towards the development of sustainable global, regional and national plans where we have that link to have laboratory biorisk management in the right place as far as possible. The vision, which is easy to say and in typical civil service understatement, very challenging to achieve. The vision is to have safe and secure environments in and around every laboratory in the world. So I just leave that thought with you as a concept. There is a mission that goes along with this. I won't take the time this morning to talk about that. So we feel that without such strategic planning, biorisk management runs the danger of failing to meet this vision, the objective of delivering solutions that allow countries to build standalone capacity and capability. So in this context, I'm using the word capability as a combination of capacity and competence, just to be clear. I hope it gives you a flavour in general terms, in broad terms, not just focused on the H5N1 situation that we're discussing in this meeting, but in a broader sense of what WHO has done and indeed are doing in the area of biosafety and biosecurity. It's very much a dynamic situation and a continuously improving situation. Very happy to pick up other issues in our discussion where I'm able to, although there are other experts on the panel who I think are very well placed to pick up those different areas. And I'd just like to finish by saying how much we're looking forward to hosting the forthcoming meeting in Geneva that we're organising at the end of February. A number of you in this room are invited to that meeting or will be invited very shortly. This will build on the meeting held in February this year, which focused on the two research studies that we've heard so much about in recent times. But it will address the broader concerns about dual-use research of concern, and it will provide an international forum where the perspectives of a wide range of stakeholders across governments and society, whole of society approach after all, can be exchanged, including health, security, defense, academia, scientific and technical associations, societies, journals, ethics, biotechnology, and of course private sector stakeholders. So absolutely finally, just to say that the World Health Organization is very pleased to participate in this continuing dialogue with all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Harper. Our final speaker is Dr. Gary Kobinger, who's the head of Vector Design and Immunotherapy Special Pathogens at the National Microbiology Laboratory, the Public Health Agency in Canada.
Thank you. I just briefly want to repeat that my opinion or position is not necessarily reflecting the one of my agency and Government of Canada. I've been again more focusing on the questions, and on the first question about common principle, I think there is common principle in biosafety, biosecurity, and these include answering questions of importance locally, nationally, internationally, regarding if the agent is endemic, preventable, treatable, fatality rate associated to it, extra. But overall, this may lead to have different answer to the same questions. And an example I'll give you is CCHF, which is a level 4 agent in Canada's Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever virus. This virus is a level 3 agent in South Africa. And this is to recognize that there is a possibility to have, again, the same answer, the different answer for the same question, but it's to recognize that each location should be assessed in a case-by-case basis for each proposed project, and to recognize the feature and the strength of each location. I think in this regards there is a problematic associated with trying to harmonize everything and to say that all the level 3 should be, they could meet the minimum requirement. But the example I'd like to give you is a facility in Madison, which I've not visited, but I've seen pictures. And in many features of that location has specificity that goes beyond what normally is expected, to my knowledge, of a biosafety level, enhanced biosafety level 3 lab. And at least the one I've worked in Canada and here in the US. So to try to harmonize and bring the bar to, for example, this location, the same level, it will be basically impossible for a lot of other locations, which are still appropriate to do a lot of work on and answer different scientific questions. I think what could be improved is the development of a continuous link between biosafety, biosecurity, the dual use work, and scientists, and maybe here involved, we talked about communication yesterday, but maybe involved what we call community liaison, but it could also be maybe called public liaison to favor transparency, basically. At all level of the process, even from evaluation of proposal to acceptance of proposal, and to and it's not for me to decide how this should work, but as a suggestion. I think this will optimize the process. Right now, it's more ILO like groups that have specific input, but there's not this continuity in the process. I think that one thing I wanted to mention, it's something that I heard and I've been thinking about it, and I thought it makes a lot of sense, is to not fall in the trap of relying only on biosafety, biosecurity, and legal groups to make decision, and to involve this could be seen, in my view, as relying only on the scientists to self-regulate themselves, aside from the conflict of interest problem. But I think everybody will agree that their job, and by definition, biosafety, biosecurity, and legal people are risk adverse, and for them to not do the experiment is what's safe, and it's what has no risk attached to it. But from another angle, as was said also yesterday, to not do the experiment, not do the work, or not advance the knowledge has a big risk attached to it, which is that again, these things are being done in nature, and reacting is always less efficient than preventing. So an assessment with the comprehensive approach involving all sites should be optimal, and finally the assessment should be considered to more dangerous version of the agent is something I wanted to mention also. So if the initial agent is going where features are going to be knocked out, well, this is where it starts. If an agent is thought to be acquiring some features, then the final possible agent is what should be the point of discussion. And again, the goal is to predict and to prevent natural infectious event, and stop reacting all the time, where we spend a lot of time in identifying the agent and then focusing on diagnostic, and then after weeks of work trying to find solution with vaccine and treatment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That ends our session with the panelist presentations. We now move into the moderated panel discussion, and for this I turn over to my co-moderator, Kristen.
And actually, I'd like to just turn to our meeting co-moderators to see if you have any comments or questions following the panel discussion, or the panel presentations.
I would just raise one question. Today, particularly, and up in the discussion yesterday, there was a lot of consideration about biosafety level that's appropriate for managing this organism. 3 enhanced, 4, those have been the debates back and forth. A number of you have offered your views on this. If you were to persuade or to offer the evidence for someone who did not have experience in understanding exactly what each level entailed, how would you describe the appropriate level of safety in the facilities that manage this research that ought to be the core requirement wherever it is conducted?
So let's see if we can turn to, we've had a few opinions on this today, so maybe we can actually start with you, Dr. Kobinger.
This is also a very difficult question, but I think there's ways to do this. I think it goes down to communicate efficiently the feature of each of those environments and how they address the agent that is being that is being worked with. And I mean, I think it needs a little time to come up with the right wording and the right images. And I don't have I'm not going to go and tell you that I know about this, but I think really, you know, these labs are a box in a box, and they are, in that view, maybe easy to explain. And some have showers, some don't have showers, and I think there is images that can be developed. There's a strategy, there is a communication strategy that can be developed to really explain why an agent is being worked with in this environment and what it entails, what it means for somebody to go in, to work, and to get out with simple images. So I think it's possible, and I think it will be very useful, as a matter of fact, and probably lacking right now.
How about Dr. Kanabraki, would you?
Right, so yeah, when I think of BL3 enhanced, I think about respiratory protection full-time. I think about a really strong occupational health program wherein any illness is reported through occupational medicine. One of the things I didn't mention earlier is, and I think is very critical, is to establish a code of conduct for this work such that each person is their brother's keeper, if you will. I think we're all in this together in that situation, and I think it's critical that if there are people who are not abiding by the established standards, that be reported in a way that is not punitive but corrective, if you will. So these are some of the elements that I think contribute to a good biosafety program in general, but in this context, these are the elements of, you know, above standard BSL-3 that I think are important.
How about Dr. Lundroth Shodin, would you like to add to that, or Dr. Pucciaranda? No, nothing to add. Well done. Right, thank you. One of the things that a number of people touched on was biosafety risk assessment, biosecurity risk assessment, and one of the questions that I have is, what is the role that you see the regulator or the highest level of advisor playing in biosafety risk assessment and biosecurity risk assessment, and then what's the role of the institution or the individual in that?
Well, thank you. Actually, I think it's important to differentiate the role of regulator from role of advisor. The regulator is the individual or the component that's responsible to ensure that an institution is operating in compliance with laws and regulations. And I think that's a very different role than an advisor would be. The regulator has to make judgments, and as our colleague from the Department of Commerce indicated, there could be civil and monetary penalties, potentially even criminal penalties in association with regulatory issues. That being said, speaking from the regulator perspective, I think it's critical that we have science-based, evidence-based regulatory standards that we work off of, and that we apply them in a fair and equitable way. With respect to the United States select agent regulations, there are sort of fundamental programs that are required to be in place at an institution that possesses, uses, or transfers any select agent in the United States. And Dr. Kanabraki touched upon some of these programs. It's important that these institutions have biosafety, biosecurity, and incident response plans that are designed in response to the risk, and are trained and are drilled on an annual basis. And I think in the area of these flu viruses, incident response is an area that is really critical. The possessors of dangerous influenza viruses that are regulated in the United States must have effective incident response plans, and they must demonstrate to us that the folks that use these agents understand what their plans are, and that the plans are drilled. And the plans usually have to involve interactions with the surrounding community. so that the community has a role in the event that something adverse has happened, and there's a sort of a teamwork atmosphere around these facilities.
Mm-hmm. There's some other input on that. Would you like to comment? Yeah.
So I would like to add something. I mean, for us in Mexico to implement the biosafety, biosecurity plan, not just for the high contingency laboratories BCL3, we try to match whatever we had coming from the CDC LRN, going down to the World Health Organization program for biosafety, biosecurity. So we include all the BCL2s. It took us 4 years to actually make it to work, and to include all the people and to have the new culture of work. So for these specific pathogens, I think when we started during the pandemic, that it was not H5N1, it was just H1N1. We just, together with the CDC personnel and the NML personnel that we had in Mexico, we sit down, review the risk assessment that we have for influenza virus. We didn't have much information for that virus in the beginning, so we basically took whatever it was there, and we did a list of things that there were minimal requirements to try to set up our safe environment for us. And all of those researchers that they wanted to do something, we used the same formats to try to evaluate them, to see if it was possible to share samples or isolates or so on. So that was for the critical moment, and now we use that to keep growing and how to set up the minimal standards, at least for the BCL3 labs that are around in Mexico. Mm-hmm. So, and to have a program to educate the scientists and all the universities and so on. So we're using the WHO program with the help of CDC and some Public Health Agency of Canada personnel to do this training. So that's what we're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So I think the role, obviously, of the regulator is to set the boundaries and to determine what specific elements should be addressed. As Rob mentioned, incident response, biosafety, biosecurity, these are components of a program that are established or need to be established. The role at the local level, though, is to consider the local culture, the local environment, and in fact, obviously involve the local community. And the good news in the biosafety realm is that the regulatory and the guidelines these are performance-based, and so it really does provide an institution at the local level a fair degree of latitude in how they meet a particular goal. Mm-hmm. And I think that's critical, to have that flexibility and to have all of this be risk-based and not driven by a checklist. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a very important collaboration that has to happen between the local oversight entity with the federal oversight entity.
Yes, Dr. Harvey, thank you.
Yes, thank you. Well, I think it's a very good question, of course, and I think this link between the regulator and the advisor, very important not to confuse them. I think sometimes there is a risk that they're confused, but what Robin and Joseph have already said, I think, gets to the heart of the regulatory side, and there are many, many laws in many, many countries that make very clear what the role of the regulator is. I think the advisor is less well defined. It applies at the institutional level right the way through to the global level. And in the case of the World Health Organization, as I said a little earlier, we're an organization responsible for norms and standards amongst other parts of our core activities. It's important, I think, to recognize that whilst norms and standards don't necessarily have the power of law, in a court of law, or at least looking at many countries' national laws, there has to be a very, very powerful reason why those norms and standards, the advisory elements, the appropriate advisory elements, are not taken into account. So if an organization, an institution chooses not to take account of the advice, in the context in which I'm using the word advice, from the appropriate authority, then in a court of law that would be challenged quite carefully, and I think there has to be an overwhelming, I'd be interested in my legal colleagues' view on that, there has to be a very persuasive reason as to why a norm or a standard, whether national or international, has not been taken into account, or is, why an institution has decided to go down a different course of action. So I think the WHO is very keen to help facilitate the discussions, particularly looking at some sort of harmonization, if that is what member countries are asking for, and particularly to do what is necessary to avoid divergence. I think these are some pretty key elements of that issue, prompted by the role of the advisor vis-à-vis the regulator. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
So I mentioned in the beginning of my presentation that we are actually engaging with about 60 countries, which is far more than the member states of the European Union. And the funding that we provide is actually in collaborative research that involves at least 3 countries that are members of the European Union or associated. And very often we ask for involvement also in the projects, in the research projects of countries from endemic countries. So that means that within the projects that we are funding, there is some internal control of standards of the laboratories from the developing countries that are participating. I think this is a nice opportunity to foster training and to share good practice in research. And I really take that back to my colleagues for reflection on how we could better use this tool.
Thank you. Yes, Dr. Mann.
Just to follow up very, very briefly on David's invitation, the conformance with whatever the applicable, generally accepted safety security standards are becomes a matter of a great advantage after an event occurs. There's always the post-mortem and the mandatory floggings that will have to, be inflicted by the body politic as well as by courts. And so having conformed with those, whatever the appropriate standards were, is in the enlightened self-interest, whether you happen to fall under the scope of, HHS funding, or if you were doing it with some other methodology. So it certainly makes good sense to do that from a number of different dimensions. I don't need to rub that in. I think you got it.
Thank you. Are there further points on that discussion line? So one of the other things that was mentioned a number of times was the importance of education, engaging scientists and establishing a culture of safety. Just, if you could offer somebody guidance on how you could use the culture of safety and education, just fundamental engagement as one of the other models, other than regulation. What would that look like? Yes, thank you.
Maybe I can start. We've had some discussions about this in relation to some of the bigger projects that are looking at the influenza research, and there is some best practice under development, I should say, under discussion, under scrutiny, under development, which is based on setting up some what we call ethics liaison within a collaborative research project, engaging maybe 15 partners or so. And this ethics liaison would deal with all types of ethics issues, but also safety and security. So that would be a point where you could go to consult on anything which is in the ethics and safety security domain, anything ranging from patient data to clinical trials involving children, to all these things, as well as what we're talking about here. So that's a nice model that we're looking at, then how that could be implemented best and fill it with content, of course. Huh? And I think this is maybe an area where we're a little bit weak in general, that we don't have a lot of expertise who will provide the contents. We can set up the structure, that's fine, but to provide the actual meaningful for advice there is maybe an area that we need to become better and to foster that better.
Thank you very much. Yes, Dr.
So I absolutely agree. I think it's in the realm of ethics training for young scientists that this is a perfect opportunity to engage young scientists on the ethics of safety and security. And actually, after 5 years of trying, we finally managed at my institution to have biosafety and dual-use research of concern added to the mandatory ethics training that our students are required to take. And in my brief experience with this program so far, I must say the dual-use research of concern topic is one that young scientists really engage directly with very, very well. A lot of great discussion on those topics. So this goes back to what I said in my earlier comments about educating the public about the importance of our work and the steps we take to manage our risks. I think it's important that that be understood.
Thank you very much. Matthews.
In education, then the finer piece of that is who is your target audience. I think the target audience for the researchers is by far the easiest of the layer of target audience. Standing in the middle of the room here is the little elephant wagging its tail that says 60-day moratorium. Well, that's been a year. That elephant is a year old now. So at some point, the moratorium will be rolled back. And an organization as certainly as sophisticated as NIH and HHS will have thought through the education for those other target audiences. So Dr. Fineberg's question was very important about how do you explain bio-level 3 enhanced to a lay audience. And the lay audiences are sort of at least 3 layers. The first one would be the press, okay? So you're going to have a 1 paragraph, 3 or 4 sentence paragraph to talk about what Gary just explained, what is BSL-3 enhanced. And then you'll need to be able to explain it to the various organizational administrators and managers and apparatchiks that will be looking over your shoulder. And you have to be able to explain this to the public, regardless of, again, whether this is under the scope of HHS federal funding or done internationally. It's the same problem and same issue. So, anticipate, it's not hard to figure out what's coming, and it's just important to be prepared.
Thanks. Thank you, Dr. Yes.
Thank you. So the issue of education and awareness raising for scientists and others, I think there's a lot of good stuff that's been done, lots of models, whether in undergraduate training, postgraduate training, ethics. I think we've been making progress, maybe not in a particularly visible way, but still progress over a period of years. If I think back to my undergraduate days, this was not something that was a feature at all. And I think in the past decade, probably, we've begun to address some of those key issues. How to do it will always be an issue. It needs good communicators. There are some great communicators looking around this room. Scientists themselves, I think, need to demonstrate that scientific leadership I think there are professional societies around the world. There are lots of vehicles through which this can be facilitated, through continuing professional development schemes, through revalidation in professional qualification terms. But I'm quite sure that this is, at least in part, if not in large part, an issue of scientific leadership and what I'll call responsible stewardship.
Thank you very much. To add to that. So the question 2 is one that's maybe a bit technical in nature about the experimental design as one of the risk mitigation measures. I was wondering if anybody could speak to that a little bit more. Maybe Dr. Kobinger, you have spoken a little bit about you know, that it can be done safely, but I wonder if you can talk about the controls themselves that would mitigate the risks associated with this type of work.
I mean, there's always room for improvement, I think. That being said, I think these experiments were very well designed and very well, the oversight was very good, the environment were very good. So it's a little bit difficult in my view, but one thing that I mentioned that I think could be improved again is clear communication to the public. Is instead of them seeing the result of a study and sometimes with an angle that is not the intended goal of the study, maybe at the beginning even of before the work is being done, maybe during while the work is being done, this could be something to consider. And again, I think it's important to emphasize that each site needs to be evaluated in regards to the specific project that is proposed. And that some sites have specifications that are that could be more valuable for a type of work, and other sites that could be valuable for another type of work. And these two sites could be different. And each location and each project, you know, needs to be evaluated with those angles, and to realize that at the end of the day, each countries will decide themselves what they think is appropriate. Although, of course, this is where having international regulation helps sometimes as guidelines to guide those decisions.
Yes, Dr. Wyatt, thank you.
In terms of experimental design, as an assessor or a regulator, I'm always more comfortable with experiments that are highly defined, that start off with a good understanding of what your starting material is, and especially with the technology and tools available today at the molecular level, what you're working with in precisely what you want to do at the molecular level. It makes it a lot easier, I think, to assess issues such as consequence. What I'm less comfortable with are experiments that are sort of prone to serendipity. You know, let's just passage something in a system for a while and see what happens, and then once we have this product, let's study it and see if we can understand it better. I think those types of protocols are more difficult to assess.
Yes, thank you very much.
I don't know to what extent this was done. I think again, like the experiments that were done that are the subject of this meeting they were well designed. But I wonder now if there should be maybe more emphasis on thinking about, okay, so if we get this, what's the appropriate environment for this agent now with added feature? And are we going to have a good vaccine? Are we going to have good drugs? So I'm not saying that it was not done, but I think in the light of all the reflections that have been going on, I think this could be emphasized in the future. But this is going to be hard because then you also get into the unknown and a little bit speculative part of the thought process.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Dr. Covender. Yes,
I just want to raise an issue which I'm not at all an expert myself, but it came up yesterday in the discussion. I think it's going to be worth picking a bit on your brains here while you're still here, because it refers to this question, and the issue is really the attenuating mutations, attenuation of pathogenicity that could be relevant in some of the experiments to increase safety. Maybe. Sorry to take over from you, but if somebody has some views on that.
Yes. You good? Dr. Kennebrook?
Yeah, so again, I think, to always consider biological containment, some element of biological containment when possible, and to use attenuated strains for the initial experiments if that is scientifically sound. Ultimately, you have to do the ultimate experiment, I think, but maybe you don't have to do. Maybe that's the last experiment you do, and so some of the basic information that can be gathered in backgrounds that are perhaps not so risky.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I agree. Actually, this also could open the door to more testing on vaccine, for example, with a virus that is not what you ultimately want to be working with, but as a first step. I agree.
So we're doing well for time. I just wanted to ask the panel if they had any other things that they would like to add to fill out this discussion.
Just briefly, again, I think one thing I touched upon earlier, and we haven't really talked a lot about, but code of conduct, I think, this is something that has been mentioned yesterday, and I've really observed that for our select agent program, we have a written code of conduct that our scientists sign, and I had a number of them visit with me in my office to talk about it before they were willing to put their names on the dotted line, so to speak. But I really believe that pushing it to that level establishes a level of commitment that maybe you don't get if there isn't a signature required. So code of conduct and establishment of code of conduct here, I think, is very important.
I'll put in a summary plug with respect to the core question of what conditions the research should be conducted under, which is, to summarize what I said earlier, a license to release the type of technology that we're speaking about here to foreign persons or outside the United States is required from the Commerce Department unless that technology is published or intended to be published, widely available without publication limitations, is the result of fundamental research which has the same intent to make widely available without restriction concept to it, or is otherwise within the scope of whatever government funding conditions exist with respect to the creation of that research. And if you have questions, the way I've just laid it out in a long sentence is rather straightforward, but there are lots of details behind it. We have a significant amount of outreach and education and are willing to speak with anybody that would like about how to better comply with the existing regulations, which again are there as a matter of law and international agreement. And our website is www.bis.doc.gov. Or my email address is kevin.wolf@bis.doc.gov. So if any of you want to follow up further on the scope of U.S. export control laws, don't hesitate to give us a call, and we'd be happy to speak with you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the last point. In that case, I will turn it back over to Dr. Reed to lead the audience discussion.
All right, thank you, Kristen. Okay, so I guess we're on to the final session for this morning, and that's it gives you an opportunity to ask our panel your questions. And just like yesterday, if you could just introduce yourself and then a question. Thank you. A comment.
Peter Hale, Foundation for Vaccine Research. On the issue of whether future gain-of-function studies with H5N1 should be conducted in enhanced BSL-3 or BSL-4 laboratories. My understanding was that and Nancy, please correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding was that the proposal that was on the table the HHS CDC proposal, that was on the table was that for the purposes of experiments that would increase the transmissibility of H5N1, that H5N1 should be classified as a Tier 1 agent. That would require that those studies be conducted in a BSL-4 laboratory. Nancy, am I right or am I wrong? Isn't that the proposal that's on the table?
I can speak to that. No, that's not true. There are Tier 1 agents. All of the bacterial pathogens that are on the Tier 1 list are BL3 agents.
Yeah, there isn't a specific link between the Tier 1 requirements and biosafety level 4.
Tier 1 think of Tier 1 as security driven, not biosafety.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Don Willie, Wright State University. Okay, if novel variants are being created that have never before been seen in nature, and then on top of that, you're passing this through animal models where there could be further mutations that are unknown, then one cannot say that there are effective treatments because that's simply not known. So rather than try to move these potentially dangerous variants that are resistant to therapy to a higher level after the fact, wouldn't it be more prudent from a public health standpoint to test them at a higher level, and then if they're found to have effective treatments, then allow them to be studied at a lower containment level?
If I may. As far as I know, none of the studies we've been discussing are really targeting the neuraminidase here, and so I don't think there's a reason to anticipate that something that might emerge would not be sensitive to the drug. But the point of all this research is, in fact, to develop antivirals and therapeutics, and it's the balancing act between making sure this work gets done in a timely fashion or not. And I really am worried that pushing it to level 4 is going to slow down the advancement of drugs and therapeutics and vaccines that are necessary to mitigate the threat from nature, and that is not under our control. So again, there's not a perfect answer here, but I think that as long as you do your testing early on, as these viruses are emerge, and if you identify something that is in fact resistant, now you move it to level 4. This is I think, a reasonable approach.
Any other opinions from the panel?
I would agree. I could add also that all the level 4 agent could be safely handled in an enhanced level 3 like it was done in this case. There's a lot of added feature in a level 4 because there's work being done, but as a matter of fact, if you take Marburg virus, initially it was working level 2, just with the mask. So I agree with you.
Yes, sir.
Gary Mung from Hackensack. So the issue that I have and I'm watching is for the gain of function, if you are truly going to embrace biosafety and go back and work with code of conducts, what are you giving as what I tend to feel is the right to know to the laboratory personnel who are going to be working with these agents, because you want to start off with a common understanding of the agent. So there is, as Dawn said, there's great variability. You're going to start with a select agent or a characteristic, but you're going to be adding this gain of function. So how often do you review with your workers the right to know of the information as it's becoming available through data on maybe the need to go back to codes of conduct or practices? I might agree that collapsing from a 4 to a 3, you're going to be prudent in managing the questions that might arise, but people are learning real time. They're not coming in fully versed. You're doing extreme training, but you really don't know enough about the agent. So as I said, you're changing the characteristic of the agent. So I would just like to address this transparency and the right to know from going back and educating.
Again, it's about communication and opportunities for discussion of the results and the implications of those results. And again, well, what we do is we have monthly meetings with all of our staff wherein we talk about these issues, and this is happening monthly. So it's all about reinforcing what we know, reinforcing what we don't know, and making sure that everyone is understanding what their role is and what their procedures are in the event of an untoward occurrence. In terms of the formal reattestation, if you will, of the code of conduct, that's an annual event for us. So this is an ongoing dialogue. It's not a snapshot in time.
Do any of the other members of the panel have anything to contribute to that in terms of experience or other sort of frameworks of monitoring or oversight over the, I guess, yes, whether there's adherence or following up? Yes.
Well, with respect to the select agent arena, part of the regulatory responsibility of a facility working with select agents is if any of the work results in a significant change to the risk profile or their biosafety plan, they need to adjust their biosafety plan accordingly, and they need to provide their regulator with an updated biosafety plan and an amendment of the regulation. So within the regulated space, there are some oversight requirements. A lot of these, probably a lot of these advances come in little steps. So I would concur with my colleague here that it's important that on the ground at the local level that there be routine updates on where the work is going, so that whenever a significant change in the risk or characteristics of the work in a lab occurs, that they can adjust their biosafety, their security plans, and then notify the regulator.
Any other thoughts on that? Okay, next question.
Thank you. Dennis Dixon from NIH, NIAID, and I have a question for Dr. Lonroth. So Anna, in your comments where you were speaking as an individual associated with the European Commission and funding decisions for a large number of countries in the European Union and beyond, you made a comment something along the lines that you wouldn't want to see publications and research stifled. So that's certainly an admirable goal. I noticed you were keenly observing the discussions yesterday and this morning. So would you be willing to give a comparative statement on where you think the stringency level is in the European area versus the United States relative to the tone of the discussions we've had here, where on some of the experiments and case studies that we went through yesterday, for example?
Okay. Well, as I said, we're working not only with the EU countries in the projects, and everyone is aware of the fact that some countries are less well equipped. So part of the objectives in the projects that we're funding is, let's say, to raise the capacity also on the safety and security issues. Goes without saying in a way, because in these collaborative projects, everyone is obliged to follow the national EU legislation, and it doesn't work like because we have a developing country, then we can sort of use maybe less stringent rules in another country to conduct experiments. It's absolutely out of the question. So that is, we're very, very keen on that aspect. Well, I mentioned the fact that we need, of course, in whatever measures we take, to make sure that we don't stifle or suffocate research which is absolutely necessary for public health. It's been mentioned many times yesterday as well. That is a general statement, of course. It's not it's not to be interpreted that everything can be published at any price, no matter what it contains. Of course, there could be situations where you have really, let's say, delicate information that should not be published. And we have to, I think this is part of this very difficult exercise, to better understand what mechanisms we actually need to put in place so that we can reach a system, let's say a control system that actually works in practice, that doesn't harm very legitimate research that actually needs to be done at the same time as it provides security. It's a very difficult issue, and I haven't heard, to be very honest, I haven't heard from anybody here really a good idea, and I think we're all confronted with this big challenge. And we're trying to kind of throw a hot potato between us here. It was in all the panels yesterday and as well as here. I think I talked to people bilaterally and in the field and in the press as well. You have the feeling of this is something that is so hard, no one can actually give a good answer to how we can solve this. So I don't have a good answer to you, Dennis, I'm sorry, but I think we are fighting with the same problem. I hope we see it also in the same way. What I said also was that we're looking at EU law as it is now. There are basically 5 different components. I didn't have the time to go into what they are because I wouldn't have had time to explain the system then. But there is national law and there's EU law, and national law cannot contradict EU law. But that package together, when looking at that, is good enough. We consider good enough for what we have confronted today. I can't guarantee, though, that will be good enough for all possible situations in the future, and that's something we'll have to look at.
A simpler question.
Pardon me?
I have a simpler follow-up question. Okay. Have there been projects that passed peer review in the European Union that were not funded because of dirt concerns?
There is a possibility that projects that pass scientific review will be stopped, blocked, definitely not funded for whatever ethical, if you take the broad definition of ethics here, including safety, security, dual use, there is a theoretic possibility that can happen. To my knowledge, it hasn't happened because we tend to enter in a dialogue with the applicants to find a good way out. And I have not seen an example where such a dialogue has not been able to produce a result that everyone can live with. Maybe it's happened. We have a lot of projects out there in other areas, but to my knowledge, it hasn't happened. But we are very happy, Dennis, to discuss further and compare our protocols and how we work, because I think this is the good way forward to learn from each other what worked and what didn't work.
Thank you. Yes, next question, sir.
Thank you. Harold Jaffe from CDC. There was a question asked yesterday that I wonder if this panel could re-explore. And the question involved breaches of biosafety and biosecurity. We were reassured that in laboratories that handled Tier 1 select agents, these were reportable. So I wonder, number one, if Rob Wyant can tell us what actually is reportable. Number two, is that the case in other laboratories? And third, to add to the length of the question, is this something the public has the right to know? In other words, if I'm John Q. Public and my money supports a BSL 3+ or 4 laboratory, and there is something dangerous that goes on there, do I have the right to know that or not?
Harold, I'll start off with the easy part of your question. Yeah, there is a system in the regulations. There's a reporting requirement. It's called the Theft, Loss, and Release Reporting Requirement. And we interpret that regulation fairly liberally. We instruct regulated entities that if they have any incident where there's any concern at all that there may have been even a potential theft, loss, or release, that they report that to us. And the regulated community has been very receptive to this. In the last since 2003, we've gotten a little over 700 of these reports. The vast majority of them turn out to be incidents of minor consequence that are easily contained by the plans that are already in place at these entities. But there is in the regulated community a formalized reporting program, and we also have follow-up activities that we do in response to these.
Does that include the exposure of laboratory staff to pathogens?
Yes, sir. It most certainly does. Any even anticipated exposure If you're working in a laboratory and someone drops a vial, even if there's thought to be very little chance that someone may have been infected, we strongly encourage and some would say we require that to be reported to us, and then we do the follow-up.
I mean, as a general matter, the transparency and the sunshine is better over the long haul for the credibility of any kind of publicly funded research or any private entity as well. The limitations in the non-public sector, you know, is sort of the trade secret and that issue. The limitation in the public sector is the privacy of the individual. So if I dropped the beaker, I don't know that, and my family had to be, you know, tested and whatever the results of the testing came out, then you get into some sort of HIPAA type privacy issues. But in general, not only is it smart science, it's good politics, and I think it's good biosafety, because if that information is publicly available, then that makes the organization much more attuned to react to and head off and prevent future occurrences because it's in the public domain.
Any additional perspectives?
So again, I would just add that yes, we do require this reporting, and it is something that, from my experience, we get. Whether it's a real genuine exposure or a potential exposure, this does come to us. We in turn review this during our monthly meetings with all of our staff, so it's reported throughout the laboratory at that level. It's also discussed at an IBC meeting, and our laboratory is located on the campus of a national laboratory, and I attend a weekly meeting, a safety meeting with staff of the national laboratory, and we report any of our incidents in that environment as well. I also am aware that I know of one national lab, level 4 laboratory, that actually posts their exposures on their website. So I do agree, this is a public right to know. I think it's part of, again, educating the public about our capabilities and how we respond to these things, and in fact, the genuine biosafety risk associated with it.
Thank you. Yes, sir. Next question.
Yeah, my name is Richard Henkel. I'm with the CDC Select Agent Program. And I have a question. We really are talking here, when we talk about BSL-4 and AG3 and Enhanced 3, about biosafety. And that really addresses unintended releases. That's accidents is the concern there. That's what you'll get by moving potentially up or down for some reason, but I'm not sure that's the solution. Has any thought, but there's the intentional release component, which is not directly related to the biosafety level. It's more, like someone said, related to the tiering. Has there been any consideration to possibly upgrading the security issues with this particular subset of the H5?
Do you want to take that too?
So again, what we found is the code of conduct is immensely helpful here, because part of the code of conduct is that everyone is responsible for reporting any suspicious behavior, any security breach, any spill, any safety incident, whether it happened to them or not directly. And on top of that, we do have CCTV, and this is something that all the investigators are aware of. And so I think that really kind of supports the idea that better report it if something happened. So we've had incidents where persons, investigators have come to me with concerns about behavior of certain individuals in the laboratory, and we've on a number of occasions had to sit down with individuals. You know, some of these things are in an isolated incident, as an isolated incident, are relatively minor. But when you see a number of things over a period of time, and it's always the same person, you have a problem. And so in order to keep, even just to keep morale high, I think it's important that the institution respond. So we've actually, for those lack of cooperation, I guess you would say, we've actually removed a person from our select agent program. There was no theft, there was no obviously, any obvious problem. It was really a question of not rowing in the same direction with the rest of the team. And it was really hurting the whole program. And so we removed that individual from that program. So it's not perfect. The insider threat is very, very difficult to mitigate, in particular with an organism that replicates. And so it is not perfect. As you know, with the select agent program, we also have inventory requirements. So I think those things help. But so we try, and I think so far so good. But we've certainly given it a great deal of thought.
Yes, sir.
Morning. My name's John Parker. I'm from Science Applications International Corporation, but in my previous life I commanded Fort Detrick. So I'd like to make a comment and then ask a question. There's been some discussion about community need to know, and I agree that that's very important for the community to know what you're doing and how you mitigate and how you keep them safe. But it can't be a single message because communities change. And my experience at Fort Detrick is that I've worked with a community that has lived with biocontainment and very interesting research for years and years and years, but you can't depend on going out once and explaining what's going on because the reaction in the community comes and goes. Year to year, one or 2 years you're the biggest employer in the community, and the next year they sort of want you gone. So working with your community is very, very important, but don't think it's a one-time thing, and make sure you have, I say it needs to be intense. Never let it fall off the shelf. That's my comment. Now the question is that as I listen over the past 2 days, as we debate the biosafety and security and where gain of function research should go, and terms like BSL-3 enhanced and everything, are we dipping our toe in the water on the road to saying that there's no need of BSL-4 anymore?
Any of the panels would like to take that? Dr. Kobinger?
That would be me without a job. So, I mean, what am I going to say? I think there's a need for them, and maybe there will be a condition found even with H5N1 that will, directly lead to the decision that it should be done in level 4. Right now in Canada, it's a level 4 agent as is 1918. So I think the need is definitely there, and thankfully we have, I think, that level as a step up if there's a need from work that is being done in level 3. But at the same time, there is this tendency sometimes to push everything in 4 just because it's safer, and I think this is not necessarily the right approach, because again, it slows down a lot of the work that can be done. The community that have access to those labs is very small, and if the work can be safely done in 3 or in 2, then it should be done in 3 or in 2, so that there's more people, more brain, more hands into solving problems. But I mean, the day we close we put the key in the door, I'll be happy, because it means that all these viruses will have, in my view, treatment and preventive measure and all of this. But in the meantime.
Dr. Harper?
Yes, thank you. Just a brief response on the dipping our toe in the water. I think it's not an issue of dipping a toe in the water. I think on this one, as colleagues have said, it's a very reasonable risk-based approach. It's a risk assessment and then whatever appropriate and importantly proportionate risk management measures need to be put in place. That's the decision that needs to be taken. So that was just a brief comment, but a comment on your comment on the community issue, if I might. And I fully agree. I like the way you describe. You moved, I think, from communicating a message to the community into working with the community, which I think is absolutely the way that we see things. I'm really pleased to say that it's long since past the time where so-called risk communicators felt that somehow if you find the right words, it's an on-off switch and you can communicate. Well, we all know that that is not the case. This is an ongoing dialogue, a relationship. It needs to be the right environment in which to have that working relationship or communication relationship. And I think the point that you make is absolutely at the heart of how we, as scientists, as public health professionals, engage with the community, and having community-centered public health policies is absolutely where we should be. Thank you.
With your permission, may I say one more thing?
Yes, go ahead.
If we're not tipping our toe in the water, and I agree we probably are, but we haven't dipped it yet. And your comment, Gary, was very good, that we have judged this on the basis of the risk of the experimentation and the risk of the result. But outside of this room, there's a lot of people that when you go to the internet, which most people will go to, and they'll type in BSL-4 and they'll see a definition, okay, or BSL-3, and the discussion of the risk of the work is absent. So I think we have some work to do, that if we're going to look at our individual experiments and what we're doing and placing them properly in a biosafety atmosphere, we need to do a better education about what is risk assessment and how risk assessment defines level.
Thank you very much for the comment.
I think this is why the comments were very important that were mentioned, to come up with strategies and ways to clearly express what is the environment and why it was selected as a correct environment for a specific work. I think this is
Next question. Renee Kiermer with Nature Publishing Group. My question is going to focus on biosafety. And I appreciate that this discussion here is really happening at the level of funding, which is exactly where this discussion should happen. But you've been talking about communication. There's been some concern expressed saying that it's not necessarily the the biosafety conditions in the work that is done by the world leaders that is of concern, but perhaps when the same type of work is being repeated in circumstances where actually necessity is driving the research. I was wondering if you see a role for journals in increasing the transparency about biosafety. And I'm thinking that when the Karaoke paper was published, there was a fairly detailed statement in the methods section detailing some of the biosafety measures. Some of them were BSL-3, some of them were what was making BSL-3 enhanced. And we've been wondering whether this should become the norm for this kind of research and perhaps other kind of research. But in the spirit of doing a risk-benefit assessment, I think I realize that this is an approach that really has limitations. We're talking about a few paragraphs. We're not talking about a 20-page paper. We're talking about something where standards are not defined. And so is there a risk that we would be focusing attention on a subset of issues that may not be the most important? Is there a risk that in areas where biosafety regulation is not as well defined, we would be sending investigator on a goose chase that would stifle publication? I would really welcome your opinion about the benefit or the risk of such an approach.
Somebody would like to address that?
I support it. I think it's very important. During the NSABB review of the two manuscripts, one of the requests made was that information about biosafety measures and biosecurity measures be included in the manuscript. I think you cannot communicate that enough. But I also think we have to communicate the value and the importance of the work. And we don't do that well enough. And so I very definitely would welcome more sunshine, if you will, on those aspects of our work. Thank you. Yeah.
Yes, next question. I'm sorry, Dr. White, did you have something to add?
I just had a brief comment in thinking about how this issue relates to the larger issue that we've been talking about in terms of building a better culture, a culture of safety and security. I think that there would probably be tremendous benefits if the norm of a journal article had in its subject or materials and methods section a section devoted to what was put in place to ensure that the work was done safely. That way every graduate student that's working on their dissertation and going through their bibliography would be exposed time and time again to this concept. I think it has certain merit.
Yeah, Daniel Perez, University of Maryland. Mine is more like a comment regarding some of the, what I see sometimes a misconception on safety in comparing BSL-3 enhanced with BSL-4. I mean, somehow there is this misconception that a BSL-3 enhanced is less safe than a BSL-4, and that's not true. I mean, that's part of the risk assessment that we do. And in BSL-3 enhanced, there is a tremendous amount of engineering in the air handling systems that make it very, very safe to handle the agents based on the risk analysis that we made. But somehow, in the general public, there is this notion that BSL-3 enhanced is less safe than BSL-4, and that's a complete misconception. And I think that's why I think we're having this discussion here on the biosafety containment that we should have, because there is a misconception in terms of the safety that the BSL-3 enhanced provides. And I think we need to make the message very clear that the work done under the conditions that we've been doing it so far is safe. Another issue is regarding with personnel and how we control the personnel. I mean, all of us working with these agents go through a tremendous amount of effort training the personnel that works. There is a tremendous amount of training before people are allowed to work in BSL-3 by themselves. In our facility, we have a buddy system, so no a single person can work by himself or herself. There has to be always someone in there. So there are a lot of things that go into this. There is a lot of thinking that goes into this to train people to do the right thing. In addition, you know, in the United States, this personnel has to have FBI clearance before they are allowed to work in this type of conditions. So I think we do our homework in terms of who finally ends up working in there and the conditions that these pathogens are being handled. BSL-3 enhanced is really very safe. There is nothing that BSL-4 would offer that would make it safer, really. I mean, if the idea is to protect the environment, BSL-3 enhanced is all we need. If the idea is to protect the person working with it, I mean, just having a hose hooked up to the outside air doesn't make it any safer than a popper. Okay, because the hose hooked up to the outside air can also fail. So for the type of pathogen that we use, the H5N1 highly pathogenic BSL-3 enhanced is all we need. Okay, we don't need anything safer than that.
Thank you for your comment. I think we have time for 2 questions. Yes, perfect. Please go ahead.
Rob Webster, I think you all know me and how long I've been in this business, worked from Plum Island to influenza, H5N1, and I fully understand H5N1. I just want to comment on the, and compliment the panel this morning. This is a fantastic discussion.
because the comments from Jean Matthews are so important. We have got to educate the public on the difference between BO3 Advanced and BO3 Ag and BO4. The agent we're talking about, HPAI H5N1 gain of function, can safely be handled in BL3 Advanced. On my life's work, I can assure you of that. But we've got to assure the public about this. And we're not doing a particularly good job outside this room. And the other thing is that we must put into perspective the incidents that are occurring in BL3 and BL4. We mustn't terrify the public. We're being extremely responsible in reporting every tiny incident. Let's put it into perspective and not use those incidents to scare the public. So this kind of communication is absolutely essential. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, of course.
I appreciate your comments. I would just say that, you know, my observation of public health is that we are almost bipolar in how we communicate over the whole arch of public health. So I think we're really being very intentional and how we're communicating within the scientific community. But there are plenty of other examples where over the arc of public health we have been spectacularly inept at communicating to the public what it is public health, or how it is that a healthy community is an economically viable community, or dealing with obesity areas. So this is simply part of the challenge of our DNA in public health, cultural DNA in public health. We tend to have blind spots in how we communicate. And so I appreciate your endorsement that we need to really be thinking out ahead. Certainly Harold Jaffe and I were trained by one of the best intuitive communicators, former CDC Public Affairs Officer Don Barrett, about how do you explain this, you know, to his father in North Dakota, what we're doing. And we've got to continue to discipline ourselves, to pick our heads back up, recognize the patterns, have our situational awareness, and how do we communicate to the public, how do we communicate to the press, how do we communicate to our administrators and folks doing so. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, our final question.
Great to be last. Great to be last, anyway. David Swain from U.S. Department of Agriculture. I had just a couple of comments to kind of flesh out some of the other comments, so maybe people who don't work in high containment labs would have a better understanding. First thing, we've talked about BSL-3, BSL-3 Ag, BSL-3 Enhanced, and BSL-4. And BSL-4, BSL-3 are well defined as BSL-3 Ag. The BSL-3 Enhanced is essentially BSL-3 with certain enhancements, and those are either facility enhancements, or they can be safety equipment enhancements, or they can be procedural enhancements. And those are decided based upon risk assessment, which ones are needed to meet the level of the experimentation and the agent that are used. So they're essentially driven by the science to maintain a certain safety level based on risk. The second comment, which is about select agent approvals, and if you are working with HPAI, it's a select agent. You have to have a select agent approval for your facility. And your personnel have to go through personnel suitability determinations to be able to work on the agent in that facility. But part of the plan that you have to have as a select agent approved facility is you have to have a biosafety, biosecurity plan. And in that plan, it has a requirement for an educational component. So you have to have a component in education for your employees who work in that particular facility. If you make changes to, for example, the agents as far as transmission or pathogenicity or procedural changes, you have to go back and re-educate those employees. So that's all part of the mechanism of being a laboratory that has that select agent approval. And the final comment, and then I'll have a question, is the comment about incidences. And just so you'll know that if you do have an instance, no matter how minor, you're required by law to report that. And it's not just a matter of reporting the instance, you have to do an investigation of what happened, why it happened, how it happened, and then you have to develop a mitigation plan to prevent it from happening again, and then you have to re-educate the employees. So this is a process that is ingrained in the whole system of being a select agent in a research lab to make sure you do science safely, and that if you do have a problem or an incident that occurs, that you investigate that and that you develop mitigation strategies to prevent it from happening again, and then you re-educate your employees to say, what do we as a group need to do differently so that does not happen again? My final is a question to the panel. I'm talking about the gain of function studies, and it seems that in the conversation, the biggest issue with these compared to non-gain of function H5 studies would be a change in both the education of the employees and possibly occupational health. So as a panel, what would you see would be needed or necessary at that level as far as education or as in the case of occupational health?
Anyone want to take that one on?
I guess I'll start. I think in terms of occupational health, I think that folks involved in this work need to be constantly aware of advances and changes in availability of therapeutics and drugs that may be available to be of use. I think institutions need to make some fundamental decisions and establish policies on based on what's available and how they'll make it available to their staff. And those policies may need to be reviewed and changed as work progresses. But I think that there definitely needs to be an awareness of what's going on in terms of the toolbox for occupational health, and that institutions doing this work need to stay current and up to date on what's available, and make sure that their workers are informed of what their options are in this area. You know, I think the policy of requiring vaccination for seasonal flu is extremely wise. You know, one of the things I think that should be a concern of any institution working with these more advanced viruses is one of their workers showing up in an emergency room with the sniffles, and if vaccinating them against the routinely circulating viruses each year can reduce that. Not only it's good for that person, obviously, but it has greater ramifications based on the work that they do. So that's sort of a first cut at your question.
I mean, I think we would probably do the same things whether we're doing gain of function or not. I mean, if there was an exposure incident, you'd want to test the strain to be sure it was sensitive to drug, and obviously the importance of that would be heightened in this scenario. But in terms of standard operating procedures, I think we're already there. I don't know that it would change that picture substantially. Obviously, an awareness that there's a potential that sensitivity has changed is part of the communication piece. But in terms of, your question is about how would you change your occupational health program, and I agree with Rob. I think seasonal flu vaccine is critical for this type of work, and I think that's period. Whatever influenza work you're doing, I think that's important. Sorry to be so vague, but I can't really think of a profound change in our occupational health program for this specific work.
Thank you very much. I'd like to just thank all our panelists as well as the audience. for their participation. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to our Uber moderator, as Amy's described them.
Well, I think you will join me in thanking indeed the panelists and the moderators. We set a high bar yesterday, but I think you jumped over it very elegantly. And in fact, you have a rather daunting job, because within an hour we will be back here and you will have to summarize this discussion. We are now breaking what on the program is called an early lunch, a late coffee break. Before we do that, 3 practical messages. First, again, just as mentioned yesterday, the lunch options include a cafeteria here in the building, directly up to the stairs. There is a convenience store in front of the cafeteria, and you can also go across the street to the cafeteria in the National Library of Medicine. Secondly, if any of you need a taxi, please sure to sign up at the registration desk here just outside the hall. And finally, and this is for all the moderators and presenters and panelists, so basically everyone who appeared here on the podium, we want to get a group photo, and so please gather just directly now at the staircase at the right. If you exit the hall at your right for a group photo. And then I'll suggest we all be back here at 12:25 for the final session. Thank you.